What is the SRIA? SRIA. Well, this acronym stands for Standardized Regulatory Impact Analysis. And for those who are involved in significant regulatory work at California's 200 plus rulemaking agencies, departments, boards, commissions, and bureaus, you may have heard of a SRIA being done for a major regulation, not for all of them. So under existing law, all regulations are required to have an analysis of the potential economic impact of those regulatory changes. Specifically, Government Code Section 11346.3 states that a state entity that's proposing to adopt, amend, or repeal a regulation is required to assess the potential for adverse economic impact on California business enterprises and individuals. So that means that these rulemaking entities have to avoid imposing unnecessary or unreasonable regulations or reporting, record keeping, or compliance requirements. Unfortunately, this short analysis is done by completing what's called the EIS, or the Economic Impact Statement. It's a 5-page, I'll call fill in the blank form, and that may be perfectly sufficient for most regulations. The state entity, prior to submitting its proposed regulatory action or actions to OAL, the Office of Administrative Law, that begins the formal rulemaking process, is required to consider the proposal's impact on business with consideration of industries affected, including the ability of California businesses, for example, to compete with businesses in other states. That state entity also has to consider information that's been supplied by interested parties. So, what does this economic assessment include? Well, the agency or department has to assess whether and to what extent their proposed regulatory action will affect the following 4 items. First, the creation or elimination of jobs within the state of California. Two, the creation of new businesses or the elimination of existing businesses within this state. Third, the expansion of businesses currently doing business in the state. And fourth, the benefits of the regulation to the health and welfare of California residents, worker safety, and the state's environment. Now, just over a decade ago, the legislature determined that for financially impactful regulations, which OAL tells me is about 10 to 12% of state regulations each year, a more thorough economic analysis is required to be done. So the legislature and governor created the SRIA process, which provides for a much more comprehensive analysis, but it only applies to what is defined in the law as a major regulation. So we look at Government Code Section 11342.548, and it defines that term major regulation to mean any proposed adoption, amendment, or repeal of a regulation that is subject to review by OAL pursuant to the APA, and that is estimated to have an economic impact on California business enterprises and individuals in an amount exceeding $50 million. And that estimate is done by the state agency or department or entity that's promulgating the regulation. In other words, since November of 2013, whenever a state entity proposes to adopt, amend, or repeal a major regulation, the entity has to prepare a standardized regulatory impact analysis and look at the regulations that have been adopted by the Department of Finance pursuant to Government Code Section 11346.36. So generally speaking, the SRIA provides for a more detailed analysis of both the anticipated compliance costs and the potential health benefits of the regulation. Specifically, SRIA has to address the following items. One, the creation or elimination of jobs within the state. Two, the creation of new businesses or the elimination of existing businesses within the state. Three, the competitive advantages or disadvantages for businesses currently doing business within our state. 4, the increase or decrease of investment in the state. 5, the incentives for innovation in products, materials, or processes. And 6, the benefits of regulations, including but not limited to benefits to the health, safety, and welfare of California residents, worker safety, and the state's environment and quality of life, among any other benefits identified by that executive branch agency. Now, why is this more detailed analysis required? Well, according to the APA and the Government Code, analyses conducted pursuant to this section are intended to provide agencies and the public with tools to determine whether the regulatory proposal is an efficient and effective means of implementing the policy decisions enacted in statute or by other provisions of law in the least burdensome manner. Regulatory impact analyses shall inform the agencies and the public of the economic consequences of regulatory choices, not reassess statutory policy. And finally, it says that the baseline for the regulatory analysis shall be the most cost-effective set of regulatory measures that are equally effective in achieving the purpose of the regulation in a manner that ensures full compliance with the authorizing statute or other law being implemented or made specific by the proposed regulation. Now, again, pursuant to Government Code Section 11346.36, DOF, or the Department of Finance, adopted regulations for conducting SRIAs. And these regulations are used to assist state entities adopting major regulations. So, according to the DOF regulations, the agency promulgating the regulatory changes is required to assess and determine the benefits and costs of the proposed regulation, expressed in monetary terms to the extent feasible and appropriate. They also have to assess the value of non-monetary benefits, such as the protection of public health and safety, worker safety, or the environment, the prevention of discrimination, the promotion of fairness or social equity, the increase in the openness and transparency of business and government, and other non-monetary benefit consistent with the statutory policy or other provisions of law. It has to compare proposed regulatory alternatives with an established baseline so that agencies can make analytical decisions for the adoption, amendment, or repeal of regulations that are necessary to determine that the proposed action is in fact the most effective or equally effective and less burdensome alternative in carrying out the purpose for which the regulatory action is being proposed, or the most cost-effective alternative to the economy of the state and to affected private persons that would equally be effective in implementing the statutory policy or other provision of law, and also determine the impacts of a regulatory proposal on the state's economy, businesses, and the public welfare. Moreover, under the DOF regulations, the promulgating agency has to assess the effects of a regulatory proposal on the general fund and special funds of the state and affected local government agencies that are attributable to the proposed regulatory changes, and also determine the cost of enforcement and compliance to the agency and to affected business enterprises and individuals, and finally to estimate the economic impact of those proposed regulatory changes. So again, the SRIA has to be included in that initial statement of reasons, affectionately called the ISOR, ISOR, for the regulation that is being submitted by that state entity, agency, department, board, commission, or bureau to the Office of Administrative Law, as well as being circulated to interested parties. And of course, that is part of the official formal rulemaking process that is undertaken by those executive branch agencies.